Welcome to American Shadows, where we uncover the darkest corners of American history. I'm Gabriel Hunter.
And I'm Grace Adler. Today, we're taking you back to the very beginning, to the first recorded crime in colonial America.
That's right, Grace. Before there was an established justice system, before there were proper courts or prisons, there was a crime that would set the stage for centuries of American jurisprudence.
We're talking about a fascinating case from the Plymouth colony that shows just how our earliest settlers dealt with law and order in the New World.
It's a tale of betrayal, justice, and the foundations of American law that you won't want to miss. Are you ready to step back in time, Grace?
Absolutely. Let's show our listeners how justice was served in colonial America when the entire legal system was just beginning to take shape.
Life in colonial America was far from the structured society we know today. When the first settlers arrived, they basically had to build everything from scratch, including their legal system.
Exactly, Gabriel. You have to imagine these early settlements as tiny, isolated communities where everyone knew each other. The Plymouth colony, where our story takes place, had only about 100 people when it was first established.
And what's fascinating is that they didn't exactly have law books or established courthouses. Most of their legal framework was based on a combination of English common law and biblical principles.
They did have their compact, though, the Mayflower Compact. It was basically their first attempt at establishing some form of written law and governance in the New World.
Right, you are. The compact was signed by 41 adult male passengers, and it established that the colonists would create and enforce just and equal laws for the general good of the colony.
But the reality of maintaining law and order was much messier than simply writing it down on paper. These colonists were dealing with everything from simple disputes over property to more serious offences, all while trying to survive in a harsh new land.
And their punishments were quite different from what we see today. They relied heavily on public shame and physical punishment rather than imprisonment. In fact, they didn't even have a proper jail in those early days.
The whole community would often be involved in both the trial and punishment process. Justice wasn't handed down by professional judges, but rather by the colony's leaders and peers of the accused.
And it's within this context that our story of the first recorded crime takes place. A community struggling to establish order in a new world, with limited resources and experience in formal law enforcement.
So Gabriel, let's talk about this historic first recorded crime. It took place in March 1621, just months after the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock.
That's right, Grace. The perpetrator was John Billington Jr., a young teenager who had arrived on the Mayflower with his family. The Billingtons were already known as a somewhat troublesome family in the colony.
And what exactly did young John do to earn this infamous place in American criminal history?
He constructed what the colonists called a device of gunpowder, essentially what we'd today call a crude explosive device. He made it using gunpowder and shot, placed under a wooden board.
It's worth noting that gunpowder was an incredibly valuable resource in the colony. They needed it for hunting and defense. Using it for mischief would have been seen as especially serious.
Absolutely. The records show that Billington didn't just create this device, he actually planted it near other colonists, including Miles Standish, who was one of the colony's military leaders.
Thank goodness no one was hurt, but it must have caused quite a stir in such a small community. What do we know about young Billington's motivations?
The records suggest it was essentially a teenage prank gone wrong. Billington apparently wanted to give the colonists a scare, but he didn't fully grasp how dangerous his actions were.
You know, it's interesting to think about this in context. Today, something like this would be treated as an extremely serious offense, probably as an act of terrorism.
The remarkable thing is that even then, they recognized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about the dangerous prank itself. It was about the threat to the colony's limited resources and the breach of community trust.
And let's remember, these colonists were already dealing with incredible hardships. The first winter had been devastating, with many deaths from cold and disease. They really couldn't afford to have someone endangering what little stability they had.
The location of the crime is also significant. This happened right in the heart of Plymouth Colony, near the common house where many community gatherings took place.
It really drove home the fact that they needed to establish clear consequences for actions that threatened the community's safety, didn't it? Now, what's fascinating is how the colony handled this investigation, Gabriel. Remember, they didn't have anything close to what we'd consider modern law enforcement.
That's right. The investigation was led by Governor William Bradford himself, along with the colony's leadership council. They took statements from witnesses who had seen young Billington with the gunpowder and creating the device.
And the interesting thing about colonial justice is that it was very community-based, wasn't it? Everyone knew each other, so there was no real need for complex detective work.
Exactly. Multiple colonists came forward to testify that they had seen Billington gathering the materials and acting suspiciously. The physical evidence, the remains of the device, was presented to the council as well.
I find it remarkable that they maintain such formal proceedings despite being such a small settlement. Tell us about the trial itself.
The trial was held in what we'd now call a very simplified court. Governor Bradford presided, and the evidence was presented before the assembled freemen of the colony. Young Billington was given a chance to speak in his own defense.
Which was actually quite progressive for the time, when you think about it. Many European courts of the period didn't always allow defendants to speak for themselves.
What's particularly interesting is how they gathered evidence. They interviewed not just witnesses to the incident, but also people who knew Billington's character and previous behavior. His family's reputation definitely played a role.
They also had to consider the severity of the crime in context of their laws, which were still being developed. This was new territory for them, legally speaking.
The proceedings lasted just one day. Quite different from our modern court system, but they were thorough in their own way, making sure to document everything in the colony's records.
And those records have survived, which is how we know so much about this case. They wrote down witness testimonies, the evidence presented, and even young Billington's own statements.
The colonists understood they were setting precedents for future cases. They wanted to establish a clear system of justice that would serve their growing community.
And despite their limited resources and experience with formal legal proceedings, they managed to conduct what was, for its time, a remarkably fair trial.
Now, after careful deliberation, the verdict came in. John Billington Jr. was found guilty of creating what they termed a public menace. Those explosive devices we discussed earlier.
And the punishment is really interesting from a modern perspective. Instead of harsh physical punishment, which was common in that era, they chose what we might call a more rehabilitative approach.
That's right. The council sentenced him to be tied to a post in a public place and given a whipping. But here's the key part. They actually suspended the sentence.
Essentially an early form of probation, wasn't it? They required him to demonstrate good behavior for a set period of time.
Exactly. If he stayed out of trouble, he wouldn't receive the physical punishment. This was actually quite progressive for 1621, when corporal punishment was the norm.
And this decision really set an important precedent. It showed that the colony was willing to consider reformation rather than just punishment, especially when dealing with younger offenders.
The case had lasting implications too. It led to the creation of the colony's first formal laws about dangerous weapons and explosives, which became part of their legal code.
What I find fascinating is how this case influenced future trials. After this, the Plymouth colony started keeping better records of all their legal proceedings, recognizing the importance of documentation.
And it established this idea of proportional justice, matching the punishment to both the crime and the circumstances of the offender. That's something we still strive for in our modern legal system.
The case also highlighted the delicate balance between maintaining order in the colony and showing mercy. They realized that harsh punishment might not always serve the community's best interests.
Absolutely. And while young Billington did manage to stay out of serious trouble after this incident, it's worth noting that his father, unfortunately, later became infamous for a much more serious crime.
The colony's handling of this first recorded crime really shows us how they were trying to build something new here, a justice system that could both protect the community and allow for redemption.
When we look back at this first recorded crime in colonial America, it's remarkable how many elements of our modern justice system were present even then. The concept of rehabilitation, documented legal proceedings, and carefully considered sentencing.
And it's fascinating that this case involved a young person. It really forced the colony to think carefully about justice and mercy, setting precedents that would influence generations to come.
Absolutely. While we might think of colonial justice as harsh and unforgiving, this case shows there was often more nuance to their approach than we might expect.
You know, it really makes you wonder about all the other cases that followed and how they built upon these early foundations.
And speaking of fascinating colonial cases, listeners won't want to miss our next episode. We'll be exploring the mysterious disappearance of the entire Roanoke colony, one of America's oldest unsolved mysteries.
That's going to be an incredible story. Thank you all for joining us today on American Shadows.
Until next time, remember to follow us wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review if you enjoyed the show. I'm Gabriel Hunter.
And I'm Grace Adler. See you in the shadows.